She held the cracking king post on her shoulder, the weight of the whole damn barn, and did not break. If this story moves you, do me a kindness before we go any further. Subscribe to the channel, follow it all the way to the end, because the part that will stay with you comes late, and leave the name of your town down in the comments so we can all watch together how far this story travels. Now, let me carry you back to where it truly began. She walked into the valley on a Tuesday, the sun a hot hand on the back of her neck. The road was alkali dust and disappointment, a story she knew by heart. She carried a single canvas satchel, and in it were 2 poplin shirts, a bar of lye soap, a whetstone, and a small, worn ledger filled with figures only she could read. She owned nothing else, because the world had a habit of taking things away, and it was easier to travel when you were already unburdened. Her name was May, and she was a large woman. It was the first thing people saw, the only thing they often remembered. Her bigness, her color, her too-muchness. She had been called a monument, a beast of burden, a sturdy specimen. She had been weighed and measured by the eyes of small men with smaller souls, and she had learned to build an armor from their scorn. The armor was a still face, a quiet tongue, and a pair of hands that could outwork any 2 men in any territory she had ever crossed. She had learned that her size was a sin in a world that prized women like porcelain dolls, fragile and ornamental. She had learned that her plain face was an affront to men who believed beauty was a woman's only currency. She had learned that her mind, which saw the geometry in a falling tree and the cold logic in a column of numbers, was something to be hidden, something unseemly. So she had built the armor, plate by silent plate, until the woman inside was a secret she herself had almost forgotten. She came to the end of the road, where a split rail fence sagged like a tired old man. Beyond it lay the Cinder Creek Ranch. It was a place bleeding out its life onto the dry soil. May stopped and looked, and she did not just see a ranch. She saw a story of grief and neglect. The land talked, and after a lifetime of listening to things other than people, she had learned the language. The irrigation flume that should have carried water from the creek was bone dry, its timbers warped and split. That was the heart attack, the central wound. Without water, the hay meadow was a brown pelt stretched over bone. The cattle, thin and dull-eyed, clustered in the scant shade of the cottonwoods, their thirst a palpable thing. The main barn listed to the west, its spine broken by a winter of heavy snows that no one had bothered to clear. The house itself, a sturdy log cabin, had a porch that was pulling away from the main structure, a quiet divorce of timber and nails. This was a place a man had loved once and then had stopped. Grief was a poor farmer, and it had let the weeds grow thick. May felt a familiar ache, not of pity, but of recognition. She understood broken things. She knew how to make them whole. She walked through the broken gate, her boots scuffing in the dust. A man came out onto the porch, moving like someone wading through deep water. He was tall and gaunt, his face shadowed by a loss so profound it had become part of his bone structure. This was Elias Thorne. He held a tin cup of what was likely cold coffee, and his eyes were the color of a washed-out sky. He watched her approach. He saw her bigness. He saw her face, her otherness. He saw a traveler, a stray, another problem to be endured. His gaze was not unkind, but it was profoundly tired. Looking for work? He asked. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. May did not answer immediately. She looked past him, her eyes tracing the dry, cracked line of the flume up the hillside. "Your water is dying on the hill," she said. Her voice was low and calm, a statement of fact, not an accusation. "The main joint is sun-shrunk. You're losing it all to the gravel wash before it ever reaches the gate." Elias Thorne blinked. He had been looking at that dry ditch for 6 months, seeing only the result, the failure. He had not truly seen the cause. He had been too deep in his own drought to notice the lands. He looked from her still, plain face to the distant, failing flume, and back again. He saw for the first time not just her size, but the focus in her eyes, the certainty in her stance. He took a slow step forward, his weariness momentarily forgotten, replaced by a flicker of something else, something like hope. "Say that again," he said. And so, she was hired. Not with a handshake or a contract, but with that simple request. He offered her the old line shack, a room in the barn, a place to be. He did not ask her name, not then. He just pointed her toward the broken thing and watched to see what she would do. The first thing she did was walk the length of the flume, from the creek diversion to the ranch. She ran her hands over the warped Douglas fir, feeling the brittle fibers. She saw where the joinery had pulled apart, where the sun had baked the pitch out of the seams, where the winter ice had heaved the support trestles. She read its history of slow collapse. Elias followed her for a time, a silent shadow. He watched as she tested timbers with the heel of her boot, as she sighted down the long wooden channel with one eye closed, as if it were a rifle barrel. She did not speak. She simply observed, absorbed, understood. He had expected a request for tools, for help. Instead, she went to the scrap pile behind the barn, a graveyard of old projects and forgotten ambitions. From it, she pulled seasoned planks of cedar, a rusted adze, a bucket of old nails, which she began to patiently straighten one by one on a flat stone. She found a barrel of pine tar, hardened by the sun, and set a small fire to slowly render it liquid again. She worked with a quiet economy of motion that was mesmerizing. There was no wasted effort, no hesitation. Her large hands, which the world saw as clumsy, were deft and sure. They knew the language of wood and steel. She spent 3 days on that hillside. She did not stop for the midday heat. She ate the bread and jerky she carried in her satchel and drank from the creek upstream of the break. Elias would find food left on the porch of the line shack for her when she returned at dusk, covered in dust and pitch. But he never saw her eat it. She was a self-contained thing, a force of will focused on a single, tangible problem. On the third afternoon, a sound returned to the ranch that had been absent for a long year. It was the sound of running water, a cool, liquid murmur spilling into the headgate and down into the thirsty ditches of the hay meadow. Elias came out onto his porch and just stood there, listening to the sound of his ranch taking its first breath after a long sickness. He looked up the hill and saw her walking back, her tools in her hand, her face as still as ever. He felt a gratitude so sharp it was painful. It was in the quiet days that followed that she met the child. Her name was Sarah, and she was a ghost in a calico dress. She was 6 years old and had not spoken a word since her mother had passed with the winter fever. She moved through the ranch like a whisper, a pair of wide, watchful eyes in a small, pale face. She saw May, this large, silent woman who had appeared from nowhere, and she kept her distance. May knew better than to force a thing like trust. Wounded creatures, whether they were children or animals, had to come to you in their own time. So, she pretended the girl was not there, but she would leave things for the child to find. One day, it was a small, perfect bird's nest she found by the creek, its delicate architecture intact. She set it on the porch rail where Sarah would see it. The next morning, it was gone. Another day, while mending harnesses in the barn, May began to talk. She did not talk to Sarah, but to the barn swallows that swooped and chattered in the rafters. She told them about the different kinds of wood, about the way a river changes its course over time, about a star she had seen the night before. She spoke in her low, calm voice, and from the corner of her eye, she saw the small girl pause in the barn doorway, listening. The breakthrough came a week later. May was carving a piece of scrap pine, her knife shaving away thin curls of wood. She was making a horse, a simple, sturdy thing with a flowing mane. Sarah crept closer, silent as ever, and watched. May did not look up. She finished the horse, smoothed its edges with a piece of sandstone, and set it on the ground between them. Then she went back to her work. After a long moment, a small hand darted out and claimed the toy. That evening, as May sat on the steps of her shack, Sarah approached. She held out a fistful of wilting bluebells. She did not speak. She did not smile. She just offered the flowers. May took them with a solemn nod, as if she were accepting a treaty. She put them in a tin can of water, and they sat there, a splash of color in her spare world. The child had been one. The old-timer was another matter. His name was Jed, and he had worked for Elias's father. He had one good arm, the other lost to a sawmill accident 30 years prior. He was as gnarled and tough as an old oak root, and his opinion of May was plain on his face. He saw an outsider, a woman doing a man's work, and a Chinese one at that. He did not trust it. He gave her orders with a grunt and watched her work with a critical eye, waiting for her to fail. May did not rise to his bait. She took his orders, did the work, and did it better than he expected. She rehung the main corral gate, which had sagged for years, by herself. She diagnosed a sickness in the new calf as alkali poisoning from a bad water seep, and saved it. She did not ask for his approval. She did not need it. Her competence was its own statement. He was won over by an act of simple, brute strength. They were trying to reset a foundation stone for the corner of the barn that listed. It was a massive piece of granite that had shifted in the spring thaw. Jed and Elias were struggling with pry bars, their muscles straining, the rock refusing to budge more than an inch. May watched for a moment. Then she walked over, motioned for them to clear out, and found her purchase. She bent her knees, set her shoulders, and wrapped her powerful arms around the cold stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Jed scoffed, and then, with a low groan that was torn from the earth itself, she lifted. She did not lift it high, only a few inches, but it was enough. She held it steady, her muscles trembling with the colossal effort, while Elias frantically shoved shims of wood underneath. She let the stone down with a heavy thud. She stood up, breathing heavily, and wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. She looked at Jed. His mouth was slightly open, his cynical gaze replaced with something that looked a lot like awe. He just shook his head slowly. "Well, I'll be," he grunted. It was the closest he would ever come to praise, but it was enough. From that day on, he spoke to her not as a curiosity, but as an equal. He had been won. It was a month into her time at the Cinder Creek Ranch that the smiling predator arrived. He came in a fine buggy, pulled by a matched pair of gray geldings, a cloud of dust heralding his importance. He was a man named Mr. Barlow, the owner of the bank in town, the sawmill, and the freight line. He was the most powerful man in the county. He was soft-bodied and heavy, dressed in fine bombazine that was out of place in the dusty ranch yard. His face was pink and perpetually smiling, but it was a smile that did not reach his eyes. It was a smile that seemed set there with a trowel, a mask of Christian concern and neighborly fellowship that May knew, on instinct, was a lie. Elias met him on the porch, and his entire posture changed. He seemed to shrink, to become less solid in Barlow's presence. The banker clapped him on the shoulder, his voice a rich, syrupy baritone. "Elias, my boy, good to see you. Heard you had some help. The place is looking better." His eyes swept the yard and landed on May, who was replacing a rotted board on the porch steps. He took in her size, her plain work clothes, her foreign face. His smile widened, but it held the predatory gleam of a man assessing livestock. "And this must be the one," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He did not speak to her, but about her, as if she were a piece of equipment. "A sturdy specimen, Elias. A very substantial woman. Good for the heavy work, I imagine." May did not look up. She drove a nail into the board with a single precise blow of her hammer. The old armor, which had begun to feel loose, settled back into place, cold and familiar. She felt the sting of his words, the casual dismissal of her humanity. It was the language the world had always spoken to her. She had just forgotten, for a little while, what it sounded like. Later that week, Elias was in town for supplies. Barlow had asked him to bring his account ledger, to see if we can't figure a way to ease your burden. Elias had left it on the kitchen table. May saw it lying there, its leather cover scuffed, its pages filled with Elias's sprawling, uncertain hand. Most people saw her hands and assumed they were only good for heavy lifting. They did not know that her mother, before she died, had been a bookkeeper for a trading company in the city. She had taught May the secret language of numbers, the elegant, unsparing truth of a balanced column. May could read a ledger the way a tracker reads a trail, seeing the story it told, the lies it held. She opened the book. At first, it was just a sad story of a man overwhelmed by grief. Missed payments, necessary loans, the spiraling cost of keeping things afloat. But then she saw Barlow's name, again and again. Loans for seed that was never delivered, freight charges for goods at twice the normal rate, interest calculated not on the principal, but on a compounded figure that grew like a cancer. She worked late into the night, the lantern light casting long shadows on the cabin walls. She took out her own small ledger and began to copy the figures, reorganizing them, cross-referencing them, laying them bare. The picture that emerged was cold and brutal. Mr. Barlow was not helping Elias Thorne. He was devouring him. He was using Elias's grief and trust as a weapon, systematically stripping him of his ranch, piece by piece, all while wearing the mask of a friend. The final payment on a consolidated loan was due in 2 months, a payment Elias could never make. And when he defaulted, the deed to the Cinder Creek Ranch, with its invaluable water rights, would belong to the bank. To Barlow, it was a slow, methodical murder by paperwork, and no one could see it but her. When Elias returned, he found her sitting at his kitchen table, the two ledgers open side by side. The look on her face was not her usual still mask. It was something harder, colder. It was the face of a judge. "We need to talk," she said. She explained it to him slowly, patiently. She showed him the inflated invoices, the impossible interest calculations, the clauses in the loan agreements he had signed without reading. She laid out the entire predatory scheme, her finger tracing the path of Barlow's greed across the pages. Elias listened, his face a storm of confusion and denial. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "No," he said, his voice ragged. "No, you're wrong. Mr. Barlow, he helped us. When Martha was sick, He was the one who paid for the doctor from the city. He said not to worry about it. He said that's what friends are for. He didn't pay for it, May said, her voice quiet but unyielding. He added it to your debt with 20% interest. It's right here. She pointed to an entry disguised as sundry expenses. He used your wife's death to put the first hook in you. The truth of it was too ugly, too vast. It was easier to believe the lie, to trust the memory of a kindness that had never been real. He stood up, pacing the small kitchen, a man trapped between a devastating truth and a comfortable deception. He looked at May, at this stranger who had appeared in his life, and for a moment he wanted to send her away, to unknow what she had just told him. But then he looked at what she had done. He saw the water running in the ditches. He saw the mended fence, the saved calf, the solid porch step. He saw the small wooden horse on the windowsill where Sarah had put it. He saw the evidence of a competence and an honesty that was as solid and real as the ground beneath his feet. And he looked at the ledger, at the smiling lie of Barlow's friendship. He stopped pacing and stood before her. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he spoke her name with the weight of its meaning. "All right, May," he said, the words a surrender and a vow. "All right, what do we do?" Their alliance was forged in that moment, a quiet partnership against a smiling monster. They began a silent war. May directed the work of the ranch with a new urgency. They had to get a hay crop in, to have something to sell, something to fight with. They worked from before dawn until after dusk, a shared purpose humming between them. The crisis came not from the bank, but from the sky. A late autumn storm blew in from the north, a sudden, violent thing that turned the sky the color of a bruise. The temperature plummeted, and the rain turned to sleet, then to a blinding blizzard. They scrambled to get the last of the herd into the barn. They were all inside, the wind howling a mournful song against the walls, when the groaning sound started. It was the sound of old timber giving up. May looked up. The king post, the main support for the roof, was cracking under the impossible weight of the wet, heavy snow. It was going to collapse. Jed yelled. Sarah screamed. Elias froze, his face white with terror. But May moved. She did not think. She reacted. She shoved a heavy grain cart under the weakest point, and then, with a strength born of pure desperation, she put her shoulder to the cracking beam. She held it. The wood splintered against her shoulder, the weight of the entire roof, of tons of snow and timber, pressing down on her. Her legs shook, her vision swam with black spots, but she held. She was the only thing standing between them and being crushed. "Elias!" she shouted, her voice strained. "The support beams! Brace it!" Her voice broke him out of his terror. He and Jed scrambled, dragging massive timbers into place, wedging them under the failing roof. It felt like an eternity. The world reduced to the screaming wind and the crushing weight on her shoulder. And then, it was done. The new supports took the load. May stumbled back, her whole body screaming in protest. Elias caught her before she fell. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her up. It was not a romantic embrace, it was something more elemental. It was the desperate, clinging gratitude of a man who had just seen his world and his child saved. He held her, this large, solid, unbreakable woman, and felt the frantic beating of her heart against his chest. He buried his face in her hair and breathed in the scent of pine and sweat and courage. He held on as if he were drowning, and she was the shore. The storm passed. The ranch survived. But Barlow, hearing of their small successes, of the hay crop they had managed to harvest against all odds, knew his prey was strengthening. He could not attack their finances again, not while May was watching. So he attacked her. The rumors started in town. A poison spread through the general store and the church sewing circle. They were whispers at first, then open speculation about the big Chinese woman living out at the Thorn place, about her unseemly influence over a grieving man, about the unnaturalness of it all. Her bigness, her color, her place beside a white man, it was all woven into a tapestry of slander. She was a witch, a whore, a gold digger. The whispers were meant to isolate them, to turn the town against them, to make it easier for Barlow to pick the bones when the time came. May felt the change when she went to town for supplies. The cold shoulders, the averted eyes, the mothers pulling their children away as she passed. It was the old pain, the familiar exclusion. But it had a new and bitter edge. It was not just her they were hurting now. It was Elias. It was Sarah. The attack came to a head in the form of Mistress Gable. She was the wife of the town reverend, a leader among the decent women of the valley. She was a woman known for her righteousness, a righteousness forged in her own private tragedy. She had lost her only son to a fever 5 years before. The town saw her as a pillar of moral strength. She arrived at the ranch one afternoon, her back ramrod straight, her face set in a mask of grim duty. She had come to confront the sinner, to defend the moral fabric of her community. She found May by the creek, showing Sarah how to skip stones. "Woman," Mistress Gable said, her voice tight and accusing, "I have come to speak with you about the shame you are bringing upon this house." May stood slowly. She did not bristle. She did not defend herself. She looked at this woman, at her righteous anger, and she saw the deep, unhealed wound beneath it. She saw the ghost of a lost child in the woman's eyes. Mistress Gable launched into her prepared speech, her words sharp with condemnation. She spoke of decency, of propriety, of the memory of Elias's poor, dead wife. She spoke of the rumors, the disgrace. When she was finished, breathless and flushed, May was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice gentle. "You lost a child," she said. It was not a question. The words struck Mistress Gable like a physical blow. Her righteous armor cracked, her face crumpled. "What?" she stammered. "The pain," May continued, her eyes full of a deep, sorrowful empathy. "It finds a home in you, and you build walls around it to keep it safe. Sometimes those walls are made of judgment. It is easier to judge the world than to feel the hole in it." Mistress Gable stared at her, the anger draining away, replaced by a raw, naked grief. She saw no sin in May's eyes, no defiance. She saw only understanding. A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "My boy," she whispered. "He was only 10. "I am sorry," May said softly. And in that moment, two women, who should have been enemies, stood together in the shared country of loss. Mistress Gable left the ranch that day, shaken and changed. The weapon Barlow had tried to use against May had been disarmed by a simple, radical act of empathy. The day of the foreclosure arrived. Barlow had orchestrated it as a public spectacle, a lesson to anyone who might defy him. The auction was to be held on the steps of his own bank. The whole town was there, drawn by the grim theater of a good man's ruin. Barlow stood on the top step, his soft body puffed up with piety and power. He made a speech, his syrupy voice full of false sorrow. He spoke of his dear friend Elias Thorne, of his tragic circumstances, of the bank's sad duty. He was a vulture performing a eulogy for the meal he was about to eat. Elias stood beside the steps, his face pale and grim, Sarah clutching his hand. Jed was there, one arm crossed over his chest in defiance, and in the crowd, Mistress Gable watched, her face unreadable. Just as the auctioneer was about to begin, a figure moved through the crowd. It was May. She was not dressed in her work clothes, but in one of her clean poplin shirts. She walked with a calm, deliberate purpose that parted the sea of people before her. She carried her small, worn ledger. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at Barlow. Her face was still, but her eyes were not. They burned with a cold, righteous fire. "Before you sell this man's life," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying over the silent crowd, "the people of this town should know how he came to lose it." Barlow's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I don't know what you mean, madam. This is a simple matter of debt." "There is nothing simple about fraud," May replied. She opened her ledger, and she began to read. She read the entries aloud, one by one. The charge for the doctor, disguised as sundry expenses. The phantom deliveries of seed. The freight charges from his own company, marked up 300%. She read the dates, the figures, the lies. Her voice was steady, methodical, and relentless. She was not making an accusation. She was presenting an autopsy. She was dissecting his greed for the whole town to see. The crowd murmured, the sound growing from a hum to a roar of outrage. People looked from May's ledger to Barlow's sweating pink face. The trowel smile had melted away, revealing the ugly snarl beneath. "Lies!" he finally bellowed, his composure shattering. "The ravings of a conniving, yellow interloper." He had said the ugly word. He had shown them the truth of his soul. And in that moment, Mistress Gable stepped forward. She stood beside May, facing Barlow. "I have seen this woman's heart, Mr. Barlow," she said, her voice ringing with the moral authority he had thought was his to command. "And now, we have all seen yours." Jed stepped forward on May's other side. Then another farmer, a man who had also felt the sting of Barlow's friendship, and then another. Soon, A wall of decent, angry people stood with May, their faces turned against the man on the steps. His power, built on whispers and intimidation, evaporated in the harsh light of public truth. He was ruined. 2 years passed. The Cinder Creek Ranch was no longer a place of grief and neglect. It was a showplace, a hidden gem in the valley. The barn stood straight and true, its roof sound. The fields were green and lush, the water from the mended flume running clear and constant. The house was painted, the porch solid, and bluebells grew in a small garden by the steps. It was May's place now, though her name was not on the deed. It was the undisputed heart of the ranch. Sarah, who now chattered like a barn swallow, was her constant shadow, her hair often braided by May's patient hands. Jed took her word as gospel, consulting her on everything from the weather to the price of beef. Mistress Gable was a frequent visitor, the two women sharing a quiet friendship over cups of tea, their bond forged in a moment of shared truth. May had a home, she had a family. The armor she had worn for so long had been set aside piece by piece, until she had almost forgotten its weight. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a long, gold light across the valley, Elias found her on the porch. She was watching the last of the light paint the hills, her face calm and open, in a way he had never seen it before. He stood beside her for a long time, the silence comfortable between them. Then he began to speak, his voice low and earnest. "When you first came here, May," he began, "I thought you were just help. Someone to mend a few things until I lost the ranch. I saw what everyone else saw. I didn't see you." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Then I watched you work. I watched you bring the water back. I watched you with Sarah, how you taught her the world was safe again. I watched you stand on the bank steps with nothing but the truth and your own courage and face down a monster. And I realized I had been blind." He turned to face her, his eyes full of a profound and humble reverence. "The world told you that you were too much, too big, too strong, too plain, and I was stupid enough to listen. But your bigness, May, your bigness is what held up my collapsing world. Your strength is what saved my child. Your stubborn, honest too-muchness is what gave us back our lives." He took a deep breath, the next words costing him more than any that had come before. "This ranch is as much yours as it is mine. More. Maybe. I want your name on the deed, next to mine. As an equal partner. I'm not offering you a job. I'm not asking you to stay because we need you. I'm asking you to stay because you belong here. Because I love you." May listened, and with every word he spoke, she felt something ancient inside her let go. It was the armor, the last and final plate of it, the one she had carried over her heart for a lifetime. It fell away, not with a clang of steel, but with the silent, weightless release of a long-held breath. All the hurt, all the scorn, all the years of being unseen and unloved, it all just dissolved into the golden light. She felt light enough to float. She was not too much. She was enough. She was everything. She turned her face to him, and for the first time she let him see all the way inside. She smiled, a real and radiant thing. Yes,